At 35,000 feet in the air with clouds trailing like silk across the windows, a scalding insult brewed in silence, not with words, but with steam. Darius King, a black CEO known across global boardrooms for his ruthless precision and calm authority, sat poised in first class. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit, a silver lapel pin gleaming under the soft lighting, he extended a quiet request for his ritual, a cup of herbal tea. Not champagne, not caviar, herbal tea. What he received instead was a rushed apology and a cup of steaming hot coffee. No eye contact, no explanation. And then an accidental spill. Burning liquid soaked through fine wool and scalded his wrist. The flight attendant's response: oops. No acknowledgement of who he was, no understanding of what had just been violated, not the suit, not the skin, but the respect. He didn't yell, he didn't flinch. He simply turned his head and said, "Get me the pilot." And in that moment, the cabin went quiet. What they didn't realize, what the entire airline would learn in the next 10 minutes, was that they hadn't just disrespected a customer. They had disrespected the man who owned the power to reroute everything. The cabin returned to a quiet hum, but the atmosphere had changed. Something in the air had shifted, not because of turbulence, but because of the man now sitting silently in 1A. Darius King wasn't just any first-class passenger. He wasn't new to luxury or unaccustomed to service. He was the architect of his own empire, a man whose influence stretched across industries and continents. But none of that mattered to the people who had just poured hot coffee on him and dismissed it with a shrug. Darius dabbed at the wet sleeve of his bespoke suit with a provided linen napkin, his movements measured, meticulous. The coffee had already stained the wool, but that wasn't what bothered him. It was the patronizing tone. The complete lack of recognition, not of his fame, but of his dignity. The way the flight attendant, Carl, had tilted the tray carelessly, not with malice, but with the entitled indifference of someone who'd already decided he wasn't worth their best effort. Carl had mumbled an apology. It was barely audible over the hum of the engines. His eyes darted around the cabin nervously, but he didn't linger to ask if Darius needed anything else. He simply disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Darius alone with the heat still rising off his sleeve and 1,000 thoughts marching across his mind like soldiers. This wasn't the first time, it was just the most obvious. The seat next to him, 1B, remained empty. That was fine. He didn't need company, he needed clarity. And he was finding it in the silence. He glanced down at the seat control, adjusted the recline slightly, and stared out the window. Clouds drifted by, unaware of the insult that had just occurred on the other side of the double-pane glass. He thought about the summit he was flying toward, a high-stakes global gathering of CEOs, policymakers, and heads of state. He was due to speak on economic sustainability in emerging markets. The irony wasn't lost on him. People valued his insight when it came to billions in development funds, but they couldn't serve him tea without dripping prejudice in the mix. And yet, he stayed calm. Not because he didn't feel rage, he did. It coursed through him like voltage, hot and steady. But Darius King didn't explode. That wasn't his way. He watched. He documented. He waited. The curtain rustled again. This time another attendant emerged, a woman younger, clearly nervous. She glanced at him, swallowed, and approached with practiced grace. "Mr. King," she began, "is there anything else I can bring you to make you more comfortable?" He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her. Her smile faltered just slightly. Then he spoke. "What's your name, Lana?" she said almost too quickly. "Lana," he repeated. "Do you know what I asked for earlier?" "Yes, sir. Herbal tea. And what did I get?" She hesitated. "Coffee, sir. We were told we were out." Darius turned slightly in his seat, facing her more directly. "Is it standard procedure on this airline to substitute hot beverages without asking? Especially when the passenger specifies a preference due to dietary or health needs?" She blinked. "No, sir. I'll double-check the galley." Donnie said, voice low but steady, "It's not about the tea anymore." She nodded, unsure whether to stay or go. Darius waved her off gently. She stepped back, almost tripping on her own heels as she turned. A few rows behind him, another passenger, a silver-haired man in a Rolex and salmon-colored blazer, whispered something to his wife and smirked. Darius saw it in the reflection of the cabin window. He'd seen it before, the shared amusement, the chuckle that came from those who never expected consequences. Darius reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. There were messages, of course. updates from his assistant, a final draft of his Geneva speech, a notification from his equity team confirming a movement in the stock price of one of his holdings. But he ignored all of it. He opened a single app, secure encrypted, developed by his own firm, and sent a three-word message: initiate the protocol. No explanation, no instructions. His team would understand. 10 rows away, Carl re-emerged, briefly speaking with a fellow attendant near the cockpit door, oblivious to the decision that had just been made. Darius didn't care about scalded fabric or weak coffee. He cared about culture, about power dynamics, about systems that let people like Carl exist unchallenged. He leaned back again, breathing deeply, letting the cabin's artificial air fill his lungs. The game had changed. The moment they dismissed his presence, they forfeited their immunity. And in 10 minutes, the flight would not be where it was supposed to be, not in the sky and certainly not in control. Darius King didn't need the world to know his name to command it. Power, real power, moved in silence, and he was a master of it. As the aircraft cruised at 36,000 feet, the passengers sipped champagne, flipped through magazines, or watched silent films on fold-out screens. But Darius sat still, eyes closed, not resting but listening. The sound of the engines was steady like a metronome, predictable, controlled, just the way he liked it. His phone buzzed once, a soft vibration against his thigh. He glanced down. A secure message had arrived. No fanfare, no alert tone, just a single word: confirmed. He didn't smile. He didn't move. But internally, a switch had flipped. From behind the curtain, Carl reappeared, his face flushed as if he'd sensed something had shifted. He hesitated near Darius's row, holding a fresh napkin and a bottled water. A weak peace offering. Mr. King, Carl began awkwardly. We've double-checked the galley, and unfortunately, it seems we really are out of herbal tea. But I brought you this water, and we'll be landing soon. If there's anything else you... Darius opened his eyes, slowly interrupting Carl with nothing more than a look. Carl stammered. I apologize again for earlier. You've already apologized, Darius said calmly. Carl stood frozen for a second longer, unsure whether to continue groveling or retreat. Darius made the decision for him with a nod toward the curtain. You may go. It wasn't rage in Darius's tone. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that told Carl everything he needed to know. This man wasn't done. As Carl disappeared again, a voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unexpected change in routing, we'll be making a slight detour before resuming course. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. We'll provide updates shortly. Heads turned. Passengers exchanged confused looks. A businessman in row 3 leaned over to his wife. That's unusual. A woman in row 6 tapped at the screen on her seat, trying to pull up the flight map. We're going off course. Darius didn't look up. He just sipped his water slowly, watching the subtle waves of unease ripple through the cabin. His gaze remained steady, fixed forward, as if he were the only person on the plane who wasn't surprised. The shift had begun. Meanwhile, in a quiet operations room buried inside the airline's New York headquarters, a notification pinged across the supervisor's screen. It wasn't labeled as urgent. It didn't need to be. The name alone carried weight: Darius King, live flight incident. Within seconds, the internal Slack channels lit up. What happened? Who's the captain? Get me flight operations now. Back in the cockpit, the pilot adjusted the controls, his fingers slightly trembling. He had received a direct message from someone far above his usual chain of command. A request, no, a directive from the airline's own executive risk division. The order wasn't shouted, it was typed. Quiet, precise. Comply with Mr. King's request. Reroute temporarily. Avoid escalation. The captain didn't ask questions. He changed the heading. And Darius King, the man who'd been ignored for his skin, for his simplicity, for not looking like someone worth respecting, now had the flight path in the palm of his hand. Down the aisle, a senior flight attendant whispered urgently to another. Why are we diverting? I don't know, came the reply. Something with a VIP passenger. We're not supposed to ask questions. Inside the first-class cabin, Lana, the younger attendant from earlier, returned. Her hands were trembling slightly. Mr. King, she said, quieter now, more respectful. I've been instructed to make sure you're comfortable for the remainder of the flight. The captain apologizes for any disruption. Disruption, Darius echoed. He studied her. Not cruelly, not to humiliate, just to measure if she understood the lesson forming around her. "I'll be fine," he said eventually. She nodded and stepped back without another word. Minutes passed, and then came the second buzz. Media alert inbound. Darius tapped the screen, opening the alert. A draft article was being prepared. Billionaire CEO diverts flight after disrespect in first class. His team had prepped it. A soft leak. Nothing formal. Just enough smoke for the world to know a fire had started. Attached was an image Carl captured mid-pour, his face clearly visible, the spill unmistakable. Another image followed Darius, calm, composed, seated with the stain still dark on his sleeve. The caption below: "Power doesn't need to shout. It just reroutes the sky." Darius read it once, then closed the app. The passengers still didn't know who he was. That didn't matter. They would. The turbulence wasn't from the wind. As the jet arced slightly to adjust to its new flight path, the tremor that ran through the first-class cabin wasn't mechanical. It was institutional. Invisible but seismic. Behind the curtain, whispers spread like wildfire among the cabin crew. Lana returned to the galley and found Carl pacing, his fingers twitching near his name tag. "Did you see what he did?" he asked, voice low but sharp. Lana didn't respond. She had, and she knew exactly what it meant. Back in first class, Darius sat perfectly still. He wasn't trying to make a scene. That was never his goal. But power, when applied with precision, didn't need to scream. It radiated. It shifted atmospheres. In his hand, his phone vibrated again. Confirmation statement prepared. Timestamp 2:15 p.m. Eston, assets, incident footage. X3, voice transcription. X1, executive profiles. X4, he read the metadata like an architect reviewing blueprints before a demolition. He had asked for nothing sensational. No spin, just the truth. A passenger in first class, a denied request, a hot coffee spill, a rerouted plane, and a corporate structure unprepared for a black man to call the sky his own. Darius tapped the screen once and locked it. Everything else would unfold without him now. In row 1B, a white-haired hedge fund manager named Richard leaned toward a colleague. "You recognize him?" he whispered. His colleague shook his head. "I think I do," Richard continued. "That's Darius King. Defense tech. Onyx. Just closed that satellite acquisition last quarter." The other man's eyes widened slightly. "That's him." Richard nodded slowly. "If he's diverting the plane, someone screwed up. Bad." Near the galley, Carl finally looked up. "I didn't know who he was," he mumbled. Lana didn't look at him. "That's the problem," she said. The air began to thin around them, not physically, but atmospherically. The hierarchy that had been so rigid just hours ago had begun to crumble. And Darius hadn't said a word since the announcement. In the airline's downtown executive offices, the story had already leaked. A junior social media coordinator, had caught wind of the reroute through a friend who tracked flight data. Within an hour, the blogosphere was alight. Anonymous source: Black CEO reroutes international flight after in-flight disrespect. Flight crew under scrutiny after possible service bias. Is airline luxury only for the visibly wealthy? The headlines weren't aggressive, yet, but the tone was clear. A narrative had taken root, and no public relations campaign could strangle it before it grew teeth. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's face was pale under his captain's hat. He didn't know Darius's full identity yet, but the tone of the internal memo he'd received told him everything he needed to know. All crew are to comply. Do not engage. Incident is under investigation. Meanwhile, Darius's assistant, Miles, was already working behind the scenes. From a penthouse suite in Manhattan, Miles coordinated the cascade. He sent the first batch of documents to legal. He delivered the incident report to the airline's compliance board, and he prepped a background dossier for media distribution, clean, factual, devastating. In the dossier, a record of similar complaints filed by first-class passengers over the past 18 months. Names redacted, patterns clear. A map of neglect hidden behind polite smiles and policy vagueness. At 36,000 feet, the cabin remained quiet. But beneath the calm, a revolution was forming. Darius finally moved. He stood, adjusted his blazer, and walked quietly down the aisle, not with entitlement, but with presence. Heads turned as he passed, some out of recognition, others out of shame. He reached the flight deck curtain. Before he could speak, Lana stepped forward to intercept. "Mr. King," she said softly, eyes wide, "is there anything you need?" He paused. "No," he said. I'm just making sure everyone's comfortable with the altitude. Her breath caught. She nodded once, then stepped aside. Darius turned and walked back to his seat, a calm center in a brewing storm. By the time he sat down, the phone in his pocket buzzed again. Incoming call, chairman of Apex Aviation Group. He declined it. A moment later, a message appeared. Please let us speak before this becomes public. Too late. The document Miles had prepped had already reached 3 major outlets. Darius hadn't signed off on a press release he didn't need to. The story would tell itself. Not because he forced it, but because the truth when exposed cleanly required no embellishment. The passengers around him remained unaware of the full extent, but they could feel it. One man had shifted the energy of an entire aircraft, not by yelling, not by suing, not by demanding headlines, but by refusing to be quietly disrespected. At the back of the plane, Carl sat in the jump seat, pale and silent, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the window. The same sky Darius had just rerouted with a phone call. He realized too late that the coffee wasn't the problem. He was. The silence inside the first-class cabin had transformed. It was no longer the luxurious hush of ambient jazz and thick carpet. It had become something more volatile, reverent, alert. Everyone now knew or suspected that the man in seat 1A wasn't just another businessman. Darius King had shifted the axis of the aircraft without so much as raising his voice. Now people were watching. Closely. Across the aisle, a teenage girl who had been sketching quietly in a notepad stopped drawing. Her mother, a tech executive from Seattle, leaned in and whispered, "That's him, right? The satellite guy?" "Yes," the girl replied softly, her eyes not leaving Darius. He made the plane turn. At the back of the first-class cabin, a mid-level banking executive named Aaron Whitford found himself glued to his in-flight tablet. His intended entertainment, an old documentary on airspace privatization, lay forgotten. Instead, he stared at the updated flight map on the screen, showing a subtle but undeniable curve in their trajectory. He tapped the screen, nervously refreshed the display. Same course, different heading. He leaned toward the passenger beside him, a woman in a burgundy pantsuit. "Did we change direction?" She nodded. "I heard him ask for the pilot," she whispered. "He's the reason." Whitford exhaled slowly, stunned. Damn. Meanwhile, up in business class, the murmurs had grown legs. One man opened his laptop and started typing furiously. He wasn't pressed, but he might as well have been. His Substack boasted over 50,000 subscribers, and this was exactly the kind of exclusive story that turned content into headlines. In seat 8C, a flight attendant named Rosa had paused mid-service. She held a tray of champagne flutes untouched. The stemware rattled gently in her grip as she stared at Carl, who stood near the galley door with his hands clenched tightly behind his back. She approached him cautiously. "You all right?" Carl didn't respond. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitch beneath the skin. "I didn't mean for this," he muttered finally. "You poured hot coffee on a black man in first class and didn't apologize," Rosa said plainly. "That's not just a mistake, Carl. That's a symptom." Carl looked at her eyes glassy. He asked for herbal tea. "I just didn't care," she finished for him. The words hung between them like a noose. Rosa had worked 22 years in the air, and she had seen how this played out, small indignities, stacking like invisible bricks into towering systems of disrespect. Most of the time, no one said a word. This time, the passenger was Darius King. Back in the cockpit, the pilot stared blankly at his console. "Tower confirms reroute," his co-pilot said, voice clipped. The captain nodded but didn't speak. His fingers hovered above the intercom button. "You want to address the cabin?" his co-pilot asked. He shook his head. "Not yet. Let them wonder." Behind them, the chain reaction had begun. In Atlanta, where Apex Aviation's North American regional office was located, the COO was already reviewing the incident log. An encrypted call from an internal liaison had flagged the detour before the automated systems picked it up. And when she saw the passenger manifest and realized who had made the request, her blood ran cold. They had disrespected a man with board-level influence over at least 4 companies that fueled half their executive charter business. Worse, he had diverted a flight mid-air and no one had stopped him. Why? Because he didn't need permission. He was the permission. In seat 1A, Darius remained composed, but inside he felt a shift. He had been underestimated before, many times. as a young founder pitching to venture capitalists who called him ambitious. As a defense contractor, presenting to men in polished shoes who assumed he built drones instead of empires. As a black man stepping into spaces where silence was dressed up as civility. But this moment was different. This time they all saw. They saw that power did not come with a three-piece suit, a European accent, or an Ivy League lapel pin. Power was clarity, resolve, the ability to make people listen even when you said nothing. The captain finally clicked the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice thinly veiled with tension due to operational reassessment. We've made a minor adjustment to our flight path. This will not significantly affect our arrival time. We thank you for your understanding. Darius didn't smile. He didn't need to. He reached into his bag, pulled out a discreetly branded tablet, and opened a secure server dashboard. A new notification pulsed red on the top right: initiate compliance audit brief. 16 personnel listed. Severity index red. He tapped once, then again, and closed the tablet. In that moment, across time zones and departments, a dozen careers began to shake. The audit would uncover procedural rot, bias flag violations, and a pattern of complaints conveniently labeled service inconsistencies. One man had said nothing, but one man had seen, and now hundreds would be forced to witness. As the aircraft sliced through the stratosphere on its diverted path, the passengers in first class had no idea that they were now flying through the eye of a corporate hurricane. They only knew the air felt heavier, the service colder, and that the man in seat 1A had just done something they couldn't fully comprehend. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened or demanded. He had redirected the entire aircraft. What Darius King had just triggered wasn't a delay or a protest. It was a revelation. He reached into his jacket and retrieved a small, black, rectangular device, something nondescript, something no one would question if they didn't know what they were looking at. It looked like a high-end power bank. It wasn't. The device synced directly to an encrypted relay in one of his company's low-orbit satellites. On the screen he saw it, the live data packet being processed through a secure channel, flagged for urgency, sealed with his biometric code, and tagged authorization Dominion A level. At 38,000 feet, most passengers were watching movies. Darius was dismantling the reputations of 3 executives with a keystroke. The file he reviewed was a compliance log. It included prior customer complaints from diverse passengers who had been seated in premium cabins, patterns that had never been flagged by management. One entry caught his eye: passenger denied meal preference, noted as not available while others received it. Another passenger of color, not addressed by name, listed as aisle seat 3A in cabin log. There were dozens. Darius narrowed his eyes, the lines of disappointment settling deeper across his face. These were not isolated acts. These were institutional, and he had the tools to expose them all. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Carl stood near the galley, fists clenched at his sides. He had just learned from a hushed conversation between 2 senior flight attendants that the passenger he had poured coffee on wasn't just a VIP. He wasn't even just a CEO. He was that CEO, the one behind Dominion AeroVentures, the one whose acquisition had the entire airline's leadership bracing for impact. "I didn't know," Carl muttered. "It was your job to know," Rosa said sharply from behind him, her voice low but precise. "That wasn't coffee you spilled. That was the last thread holding your career together." Carl's throat tightened. "I just thought, you thought wrong." The cabin staff had received a mid-air alert in their secure communication channel. Flight audit initiated. Suspended protocols in effect. Maintain passenger discretion. No one said it aloud, but the meaning was clear. Someone up there had pulled rank, and everything they'd done was now under a microscope. Even the lead purser, Janice, who had worked for the airline for over 25 years, approached Darius's seat. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed her skirt and spoke with the careful humility of someone trained to identify influence. "Mr. King," she began, "may I offer you another beverage or perhaps something to make your flight more comfortable?" Darius looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said flatly. He didn't offer a smile, didn't return her eagerness. Because this wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about precision. He turned his attention back to the tablet. With another tap, he opened the internal personnel portal of the airline. Every crew member on this flight had a personnel record: name, rank, performance, history, and complaint logs. Carl's name came up first. Carl T. Meacher Jr., flight attendant. 3 informal complaints filed. one formal reprimand. Last performance review. Needs to develop professionalism in high-stress interactions. Darius raised one eyebrow. In the world of mergers and acquisitions, this kind of profile wasn't just inconvenient, it was a liability. He tapped a button labeled Flag for Review, then paused, hovering his finger over Flag for immediate termination. He didn't press it. Not yet. Let them sweat. Further down the screen, another profile appeared. This one clean, consistent, respected by peers. It belonged to Rosa. He tapped Flag for internal advancement. A small act. A silent nod. He knew what that gesture would do once it filtered down into HR performance interviews, coaching, and a track towards senior leadership. Not because Rosa had defended him, but because she had spoken truth to power and to error. He looked back outside the window. From this altitude, the world below seemed both tiny and fragile. That's how most corporations viewed people like him, disposable, abstract. Until the day came when the view flipped. Until they realized the person they dismissed was the one who controlled the view. He turned the device off and placed it back into his inner jacket pocket. The game had shifted. Darius hadn't just demanded tea. He had exposed a system that confused accessories with authenticity, that wrapped bias in etiquette and called it procedure. And now, for the first time, they knew the man they mocked could move satellites, markets, and people with one signal. And he was just getting started. The jet hummed quietly across the Atlantic sky, but the silence inside first class had shifted from luxurious calm to a tension laced with speculation and unease. Darius King, now fully in command of the moment, had not moved much from his seat. Yet the ripples of his authority were felt in every creak of the aisle, every glance exchanged between staff members, every whisper passed behind drawn curtains. Carl had disappeared. Not officially, of course, he was still on duty, but he was no longer visible. The embarrassment had reduced him to a ghost among the living. Every few minutes, another member of the cabin crew would peek behind the partition to check on Darius, not to serve him, but to gauge how deep the damage went. They had no idea just how deep. Inside the secure network of Dominion Aero Ventures, a special task force had been activated the moment Darius flagged the initial internal report. These weren't just corporate staffers, they were cultural forensics specialists, former civil rights auditors, and digital compliance experts. Their task to comb through every social, procedural, and reputational inconsistency buried in the airline's operational history. The rot wasn't just present, it was systemic. Within an hour, they had pulled an entire library of testimony stories that had never seen daylight. Like the black surgeon who was asked to downgrade from first to business due to overbooking, while 3 visibly white passengers received free upgrades. Or the Latina executive who had documented a flight attendant skipping her row twice when offering beverages only to be told, "Oh, I thought you were with economy." Or the Middle Eastern entrepreneur who was delayed for 20 minutes because his name triggered a security alert despite his platinum tier status and frequent flyer clearance. These were not isolated mishaps. They were embedded assumptions built into uniforms, policies, and the performative smiles of a staff trained to smile wider for the right suit. Darius's team compiled them quickly, surgically. Names, dates, locations, passenger tiers, crew assignments. Nothing was anecdotal. Every story had metadata, every complaint a timestamp. And in the middle of it all was a pattern so damning it almost startled them. Incidents involving passengers of color in premium cabins were 67% more likely to be downgraded, denied amenities, or flagged for additional verification than their white counterparts. Not in one airport, across 3 continents. It was global. As these discoveries stacked up in Darius's private feed, the lights inside the cabin dimmed for the evening meal service. White linens draped over tray tables, cutlery, aligned like weapons in formation, and glass flutes filled with champagne glistened under soft ambient lights. Darius didn't touch his tray. He was too focused. His laptop, now connected to a private satellite channel, opened a secure video feed from his New York office. On the other end, Monique Alvarez, his chief of strategy, waited. "We've got enough to blow the whole damn system wide open," she said, leaning toward the camera. 3 years of incidents. We found training videos from internal onboarding that explicitly teach staff to prioritize visually professional travelers. That's the actual language they used. Darius's expression didn't change. And the recordings 4. One from a flight attendant chat forum, one from a manager's sensitivity seminar where they openly joke about how some clients think money equals class, and 2 from passenger complaints recorded, documented, ignored. He nodded once. Timestamped them all. Cross-reference with customer service logs. I want to see who received refunds, who didn't, and what language was used in corporate follow-ups. Monique hesitated. Darius, this is going to destroy them. I'm not here to destroy, he replied, his tone cool. I'm here to disinfect. In the row behind him, a middle-aged white couple whispered to each other as they pushed their food around untouched. They had been watching Darius the entire flight. Earlier, the man had scoffed under his breath when the pilot came to speak with him. But now his posture had changed. He sat straight, observing, calculating, like he had just realized he was on a plane where the center of gravity had shifted. Flight 701 was no longer just a route from New York to Berlin. It was a live case study in modern corporate accountability. Janice, the lead purser, returned quietly to Darius's side. She cleared her throat. Mr. King, she began, voice measured. The captain wanted me to pass along that we are en route to make a special clearance request with Berlin airspace due to your business needs. We're prioritizing runway access upon arrival. Darius looked up. And Carl? She stiffened. He's been reassigned, temporarily. Management will reach out directly. Good, Darius said. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. The cabin returned to silence, but now it was different. Now everyone knew that something was being peeled back. The airline's reputation, the industry's mask, a decades-old illusion of elegance and equality. And Darius was still seated, calm, focused, as if he hadn't just lit a match inside their ivory tower. He wasn't trying to make noise. He was showing them what silence looked like when it finally chose to speak. The hum of the aircraft was constant, but to those sitting in the first-class cabin, it was no longer white noise. It had become a soundtrack to something tectonic unfolding in silence. The stewardesses no longer glided with ease. Their footsteps were measured, careful. Darius King had changed the air, not with rage, not with threats, but with something far more formidable, undeniable composure in the face of institutional arrogance. He hadn't needed to yell. He had simply looked people in the eye and dared them to see who he really was. Now they were beginning to, and some for the first time were ready to act. Near the front of the cabin sat Helena Walsh, an attorney in her 50s, who had spent a lifetime building cases against corporations that preyed on vulnerable communities. A woman well-versed in discrimination law, Helena had watched the entire incident unfold from across the aisle. She had noted the way Carl spoke to Darius, the way the crew had hesitated to serve him, the way the pilot had arrived late, flustered, trying to reassert a sense of control over something that had already slipped far beyond his grasp. But what struck her wasn't just the microaggressions. It was the effect Darius's silence had on the cabin. He hadn't risen from his seat. He hadn't threatened anyone with lawsuits or screamed into his phone. Yet Helena knew the man was building a case live in real time on a moving plane. She leaned toward the passenger beside her, a South Asian venture capitalist named Rajiv Khanna, who had also been watching with interest. He's not making a scene, she whispered. Rajiv nodded. No, he said, he's making a blueprint. Elsewhere, whispers carried. One of the crew members, Sasha, the junior flight attendant, clutched her service tray a little tighter. Her training had emphasized warmth, elegance, deference. But there had been nothing in that training to prepare her for what was happening now. Not the coffee spill, not the reroute request, and certainly not the way the airline was beginning to unravel midair quietly from the inside. She glanced toward the galley where Carl stood, head low, shoulders slumped, fidgeting with plastic cutlery in an effort to seem busy. Sasha had admired Carl once. He was confident, smooth-talking, often praised by management for his natural handling of first-class guests. But now she saw it. The smirk, the avoidance, the way his eyes had flickered with indifference when Mr. King was burned. That wasn't confidence. That was immunity born from repetition. This wasn't Carl's first mistake. It was just the first time he'd been caught by someone with enough leverage to make it matter. Her hands trembled as she replaced the tray into the galley shelf. She caught her own reflection in the brushed chrome panel beside the door. For a moment, Sasha saw herself clearly not as a uniformed professional, but as a participant in a culture she had never questioned deeply enough. She straightened her spine. She wasn't going to be a bystander. Not this time. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat stiffly. His fingers hovered over the controls, but his mind was far from altitude charts. He replayed the conversation with Darius over and over, each word replaying with more weight. Darius hadn't threatened his job, hadn't shouted, but the way he had said change the route wasn't a request, it was a declaration of authority. And now, cruising a new path over the North Atlantic, the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged a situation that was now far bigger than any flight plan. The intercom light blinked. Captain came the voice of his first officer. "You might want to see this." He turned. The FO handed him an iPad with a live feed from a business news network. Breaking airline faces high-profile complaint. After CEO's in-flight mistreatment, beneath the headline, a split screen showed the airline's logo on one side and a photo of Darius King cropped from a Forbes cover on the other. The pilot stared at the screen. They were still airborne, and yet the narrative was already landing. Back in first class, Darius received a message on his phone. It was encrypted, routed through his private servers. Monique again. Subject confirmed, leak source internal. High level. Claims press team was instructed to suppress similar incidents last year. Video logs exist. Timestamped. Recommend immediate motion for public inquiry. Darius read it, then read it again. Good. It wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. Others were stepping forward. Others were remembering moments they had tucked away, too small to mention, too subtle to confront. Until now. Darius closed his phone and looked up. Rajiv Khanna met his gaze across the cabin. A nod passed between them, not one of pity, but of recognition. Elsewhere, Helena pulled out her laptop and began drafting a legal memorandum titled Systemic Disrespect in Premium Aviation, a case study in class and color, and Sasha. She wrote a note on her phone, unsigned but damning. I witnessed my colleague intentionally disregard a guest of color. Management needs to see this before it becomes another scandal. I won't be silent. It wasn't much, but it was something. In that rarefied cabin of wealth and altitude, Darius King had not just exposed a wound, he had awakened the witnesses. The aircraft's course had changed, but so had the internal trajectory of an entire organization. It began in whispers and fragments. A text from one VP to another, an encrypted message forwarded from a legal team, a flagged notification from corporate PR. But as the plane cut through the jet stream on its diverted path, the network beneath the airline's polished exterior started to splinter. Inside the airline's operations center, located in a sterile tower 30 miles from the landing airport, red indicators began appearing on the internal incident dashboard. At first, it looked like a systems test had failed to clear. Then one of the comms specialists leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "Sir," he called out to the shift manager. "We've got something." The manager leaned in, reading the flagged incident report marked high-profile client and flight service failure route. Deviation confirmed. He tapped open the attachment. It contained a complaint file from the pilot marked as urgent, stating that the course change had been initiated at the insistence of a first-class VIP citing executive override. Attached beneath that was a name, Darius A. King. And just like that, the entire control center knew they had a problem. Within 15 minutes, the airline's internal Slack channels lit up with the kind of corporate panic that no one could ever truly rehearse for. Keywords were muted. Group chats were locked. Department heads started calling emergency huddles using vague subject lines like client alignment brief and executive-level visibility. But by then, the damage was already airborne. Back on the plane, Darius King sat silent, watching the clouds from his window. But the silence wasn't stillness. It was orchestration. He wasn't just riding out the storm. He was steering it. At 36,000 feet, perception used to be everything. The polished silverware, the wine pairings, the curated announcements about on-time arrivals. But Darius had exposed something that no marketing campaign could fix. The soul of the service had cracked. And now, from the executive floor to the gate terminals, everyone was scrambling. In the airline's Manhattan headquarters, Chief Communications Officer Celeste Durham sprinted into a war room already filled with panicked faces. Her assistant shoved a printed news ticker in her hand as she spoke without breathing. Business Insider, Forbes, and Black Enterprise are already running the story. The clip of the spilled coffee is circulating. Someone from the cabin recorded it and sent it to a YouTube channel. It has over 700,000 views in under an hour. Damage control plan, Celeste barked. We've drafted a statement expressing regret, but legal wants to wait until we assess how far he plans to go. Celeste froze. You still don't get it, do you? The room looked at her. She held up the newsprint with Darius King's name front and center. "This isn't just some loud customers on a plane," she said slowly. "This is a man with institutional power, media, reach, and strategic silence. You think he's asking for an apology?" A pause. "No, he's building precedent." Meanwhile, inside the plane, Carl, the once proud attendant, had been quietly removed from his duties for the remainder of the flight. He sat in the galley with his head down, his badge unpinned, and the beginnings of a report open on his tablet cursor blinking with guilt. But it wasn't just his mistake anymore. The pilot had documented the deviation. The flight manifest confirmed the drink order. The passenger logs would show the other first-class guests, all of whom were now potential witnesses in what was rapidly becoming a scandal far larger than anyone expected. And the worst part, none of them could deny what Darius had done. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made threats. He had simply spoken, and the system had crumbled. Sasha, the junior attendant, peeked around the galley curtain and saw him. Darius still in his seat, calm, unreadable. She took a deep breath, walked back to her station, and quietly opened the anonymous employee conduct report portal on the company's HR tablet. In the field for incident, she wrote, "I witnessed a colleague treat a passenger with disregard, spill coffee on him, and attempt to minimize the mistake. When the guest asked to speak to the captain, I saw no urgency from my team. This wasn't just mishandling, it was prejudice." Then she clicked, submit. Back on the ground, investor networks had already begun to buzz. An email with the subject line, "Loss Exposure Inquiry," hit the inboxes of multiple board members. Attached was a forecast from an analyst. If not managed, the incident could result in a 12–17% stock decline over 48 hours. The market didn't need more information. It needed answers, but Darius King had no intention of offering them. He wasn't interested in statements. He wasn't waiting for conciliatory emails. He had already written his next move into the air, and as the plane began its slow descent, wheels lowering with a soft hydraulic groan, every system that had once ignored him was now forced to watch him land. The collapse had already begun. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, but what followed was seismic. The aircraft taxied toward a private terminal, its windows gleaming in the early dusk light. Inside, Darius King remained seated, still composed, while the rest of first class shifted restlessly. Flight attendants avoided his gaze, their movements brisk, their smiles mechanical. The once proud ritual of arrival had become a parade of unease, but Darius felt none of it. He had already landed long before the plane did. As the stairs unfolded and the door hissed open, a black SUV waited on the tarmac, flanked by two discreet men in charcoal suits. One held a digital tablet. The other stood with a single earpiece, not security detail, but verification. As Darius stepped out, the pilot was already waiting at the top of the stairs. His hat was off, tucked under one arm, his eyes lowered in acknowledgement. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The course had been changed, the moment had passed, but the impact would echo for years. Darius nodded once in return and descended. On the ground, his phone vibrated. 3 missed calls from the airline's corporate office. A text from his publicist. "Media has your back. Everyone wants a statement. What should I say?" He didn't reply, because silence in his hands had already become speech. By the time he reached his hotel suite, glass-walled, overlooking a skyline, trying to forget its own sins, he had already outlined the terms of a cultural review across the airline's entire operational model. He didn't need a press conference. He needed structure. He didn't want promises. He wanted protocols. The formal demand letter was dispatched to the board within the hour. It outlined 4 key areas for immediate overhaul. 1. Equity-centered staff training, visible complaint, arbitration system, anonymous reporting protections for employees, diversification targets for cabin and corporate leadership. It was more than retribution. It was reconstruction. Across social media, hashtags trended for hours. "First class doesn't mean white respect" is the route Darius King. But Darius didn't retweet any of them. He had moved beyond the moment. This wasn't about going viral. This was about shifting policy. 2 days later, a front-page piece ran in the Financial Observer titled, "When Power Doesn't Wear a Tie, the New Face of Corporate Accountability." It didn't name Darius directly, but everyone knew, and quietly other CEOs took note. HR departments in industries far outside aviation began reviewing their own executive lounge protocols. Fashion-based profiling procedures, long left unspoken, were being reassessed. In airline boardrooms and luxury brands alike, a question began to circulate. Are we prepared for a Darius King moment? But Darius didn't want fear. He wanted foundation. In a video leaked weeks later, Carl, the flight attendant, appeared in a training module, not fired but transformed. His voice was measured, humble. We're trained to serve with precision, but we were never trained to see without judgment. I failed. I saw a hoodie instead of a human. I've spent every day since learning to unsee what the system taught me to expect. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was an education. And Darius had orchestrated it without ever raising his voice. In his office overlooking the world, Darius stood before a digital map, his finger tracing the original flight route, then the altered one. He paused at the bend, the moment where everything changed, and touched the screen. Not as a memory, as a marker. That point would go down as the day a man refused to be seen only as fabric tone and silhouette, and the industry had no choice but to adjust. Darius turned to his desk, opened his laptop, and began drafting a private memo, not for press, not for staff, but for his own leadership academy. It read, "Respect is not aesthetic. Power is not posture. And dignity cannot be denied based on the weight of your watch or the shine of your shoes. If a system is built to recognize power by appearance, then it must be reprogrammed to recognize humanity by presence." Outside, the city glowed. Planes blinked across the sky, unaware that their paths were forever altered by a single gesture of disrespect. And within one man's refusal to be belittled, the world began to reroute itself. The fallout didn't wait for boardroom votes or shareholder emails. Within 48 hours of Darius King's flight reroute, subtle aftershocks were already rippling through the airline's internal framework. In corporate corridors once insulated by protocol and plausible deniability, now there was noise, meetings that were never scheduled, questions that were never supposed to be asked. At the airline's headquarters, nestled in a steel and glass fortress in downtown Chicago, executives gathered in the emergency operations room, normally reserved for weather crises or security threats. But this wasn't about turbulence in the sky. It was turbulence on the ground in headlines, and worse, among the people who had always been silent. A mid-level VP of customer experience was the first to speak up. "We've been running first class like a velvet caste system. You don't get good service. You get approved service. You're either seen as worthy or invisible." Silence, or my known. And then a senior director of public relations leaned forward, voice low but cutting. "The CEO's phone won't stop ringing. Darius King's team hasn't responded to any outreach, and the press is circling like sharks. They know something bigger is coming." Everyone looked at the internal counsel, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a legal pad full of damage assessments. She had one page open, a list of past customer complaints tagged, "Dismissed, unverified bias." The number was staggering. One by one entries were now being reopened. At the center of it all, Flight 1103, the one where a cup of hot coffee, misplaced, mishandled, and misjudged, became a catalyst for corporate collapse. Meanwhile, in New York, a different kind of movement began. Civil rights groups had caught wind of the incident, not because of what happened in the sky, but because of what didn't happen afterward. No swift apology, no credible review, just spin. They issued a joint statement: "Respect is not a beverage request. It is the foundation of service. The time has come to ground the old hierarchies and build new runways of equality." By evening, the airline stock had slipped 4.7%, not because of lawsuits, not because of economic recession, because of public doubt. Investors hate doubt more than bad press. Within a week, internal documentation from the flight crew leaked online. Carl's incident report, hastily written, had originally downplayed the situation as a minor spill during beverage service. But accompanying footage from a passenger's phone, silently recorded from across the aisle, told a different story. You could see Darius's suit visibly dampened, his face unreadable, the flight attendant fumbling eyes indifferent, no raised voice, no dramatics, just a look. The video went viral with a single caption: "He didn't shout, he didn't flinch, and still they treated him like he didn't belong." Millions watched, and then millions commented. Stories poured in. "I was in first class once. They offered me napkins instead of an apology. My father was denied a warm meal on a transatlantic flight. They kept serving others and told me they'd come back, never did." The airline wasn't just facing Darius anymore. was facing everyone he now represented. Meanwhile, at Onyx Dominion's headquarters, Darius remained characteristically silent in public. But inside his boardroom, plans were expanding. His chief strategy officer, Lena Flores, stood before a touchscreen that displayed a map of the airline's hub cities: Miami, London, Doha, Singapore. Each location was tagged with a red or green marker. Red for regions where consumer discrimination complaints had spiked in the last 5 years. Green for zones with inclusive training initiatives. The screen was mostly red. She turned to Darius. We've identified 12 major training gaps, 9 of which are in premium customer service. And we've confirmed what we feared: bias isn't incidental. It's patterned. It's normalized. Darius didn't blink. Then we disrupt the pattern. Lena nodded. We've drafted the framework for the respect protocol, mandatory inclusion modules for all front-facing airline staff monitored by independent audit teams. We've already gotten 3 other international carriers willing to implement it if we lead the charge. Darius leaned back, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Send the first wave. In that moment, he wasn't just rewriting the rules for one airline. He was blueprinting a new global standard. Later that night, Lena would write in her personal journal, "This isn't about teaching kindness. It's about unlearning power." Darius understands that. That's why he doesn't just lead. He rewires systems. Meanwhile, Carl, now on administrative leave, sat in a union-appointed therapist's office, hands trembling as he recounted what had happened. I didn't mean to. I just thought he was another difficult customer. I didn't see him. The therapist, a black woman in her 50s, didn't write anything down. She just looked at him and said, "That's the problem," Carl wept. But the world moved on. Because in boardrooms, on tarmacs, behind VIP curtains, and inside training centers across the globe, Darius's lesson was now circulating. Power doesn't dress for you. Power walks past you when you're not looking and still sees everything. And systems that forget that get rerouted. By the time the airline's board convened an emergency summit at their Atlanta headquarters, it wasn't to contain the fire, it was to assess the ashes. The Darius King incident, as they'd come to call it internally, had triggered a slow, coordinated unraveling. And while news cycles spun it as a dramatic gesture of power, those inside a company knew it was something far more dangerous: calculated reform. The first agenda item was blunt: a new internal directive titled Leadership Realignment Phase 1. 12 senior executives were named. 3 had already resigned. 5 were on extended leave. The remaining 4 were summoned to attend in person, facing a panel that included outside counsel, federal observers, and 2 representatives from Onyx Dominion Holdings. The room was cold, floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp lines of light across polished oak. In the corner, a discreet security officer stood by the door, a silent reminder that this meeting wasn't business as usual. It was a reckoning. Across the room, Sharon Keating, the airline's interim CEO, just 3 weeks into her sudden appointment, stood at the head of the table. Her voice was low, her tone brittle with exhaustion. We are no longer asking how this happened. We are now deciding who will never let it happen again. The others didn't speak. They didn't dare. From the touchscreen at her side, Sharon pulled up an internal dashboard labeled Perception Delta. It was a social listening tool normally used to monitor brand health. But this time the data painted a brutal portrait. Over 700,000 mentions tied to Darius King. Over 300,000 referencing disrespect in first class. Spikes in hashtags like reroute, respect, and airline bias. One phrase appeared in glowing red at the center of the screen. He didn't shout, he rerouted. It wasn't just a meme, it had become a slogan, printed on protest signs, shared in boardrooms, quoted in HR diversity briefings. One of the executives, Marcus Whitmore, VP of International Guest Experience, finally spoke. We've taken a hit, but it's a media cycle. It will pass. Sharon turned to him slowly. We didn't take a hit. We exposed a fault line, and we can't PR spin our way out of a structural failure. Her eyes narrowed. Mr. King didn't reroute a flight. He rerouted our future. Meanwhile, behind the glass walls of Onyx Dominion's East Coast Strategy Division, Darius was already moving 3 steps ahead. Lena Flores, seated beside him, flipped open a slim black folder. Inside was a detailed proposal titled The Herbal Accord Initiative, a global charter for equitable treatment in luxury travel spaces. It was co-signed by 5 major Black business coalitions, 3 international airport equity committees, and now, to Darius's surprise, 2 rival airline CEOs. Not because they wanted to support his cause, but because they feared becoming the next cautionary tale. This isn't about one airline anymore. Lena said, her tone brisk, confident. It's about setting the standard. Darius nodded once. Then we raise it. They weren't interested in symbolic apologies or glossy diversity campaigns. They wanted structural change. And so the Herbal Accord Initiative outlined 10 non-negotiables: anonymous auditing, inclusive service protocols, blind seating assignment reviews, and customer interaction assessments, scored not by speed but dignity. Most revolutionary, a new clause stating all luxury class staff must undergo quarterly bias immersion simulations in which they are treated as invisible. It wasn't theater, it was education by reversal. As Darius reviewed the final pages, he noticed a handwritten note from Lena in the margin. You turned spilled coffee into a movement. What else can we turn upside down? The thought lingered. Elsewhere, Carl, the flight attendant, sat in a union arbitration room with his lawyer. His posture had collapsed inward. He didn't look like the same man who had once poured coffee with careless hands and passive judgment. He looked like someone who had seen the other side of assumption and was now living in its aftermath. The investigator slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Mr. King has declined to pursue individual legal action against you, she said plainly. Carl blinked, but she added, he did request your name be added to the internal accountability review with a recommendation for empathy-focused retraining. Carl looked at his lawyer, then back at the paper. He doesn't want me fired. He doesn't want you to be the story, the investigator clarified. He wants the system to be. Carl nodded slowly, the guilt still etched across his face. Back in Darius's private office, the day wound down with a single message from an unlikely source, the airline's new CEO, Daniel Reeves. It read, Mr. King, I've received the full charter. I've signed the Herbal Accord. Not because of praying, because I finally understand the cost of not listening. Thank you for showing us that silence is the real turbulence. Darius stared at the message for a moment before forwarding it to Lena with just 3 words. Send phase 2. Because justice wasn't about one man's victory. It was about making sure no one ever had to win this way again. Ban Kamun Viet Tip Fan Tip Teo Hung. Band and I write part 13. ChatGPT and I. Part 13, The Silent Committee, 850 words. The room was quiet, too quiet for a boardroom in crisis. 12 chairs lined a glass conference table inside a nondescript tower in downtown Manhattan. The building bore no airline logos, no media banners, and no press badges were allowed within 20 floors. This was not a public apology. It was something far more calculated. It was survival. The airline's remaining executive leadership had convened what was unofficially dubbed the Silent Committee, a damage containment group comprised of crisis managers, legal analysts, and corporate psychologists. Their goal wasn't to argue with the public, but to decode it. And all of them had one name scribbled across their notepads in heavy ink, Darius King. Gentlemen, began Jacqueline Rowe, the newly appointed head of strategic brand recovery. Her voice was clipped, her eyes hard behind thin silver-framed glasses. We're not dealing with bad optics anymore. We're dealing with irreversible systemic backlash. We're not here to debate what went wrong. That plane already landed. We're here to map out how not to go extinct. She tapped a control panel on the table and a projection flickered to life slides of news footage, influencer reactions, and live streams of everyday passengers recounting mistreatment in airports across the country. One clip was particularly damning, a viral video of Darius calmly sipping coffee in his office, while news anchors breathlessly debated whether one man's quiet defiance had just shifted the entire aviation industry. It wasn't just media traction, it was cultural gravity. We built our brand on elegance, said CFO Grant Mason, visibly sweating. We spent decades marketing exclusivity. You marketed exclusion, Jacqueline corrected, and you got caught. He shifted uncomfortably. So what now? We host listening sessions, donate to some causes, feature more diverse faces in our next campaign. Across the room, someone scoffed. No, Jacqueline said, pulling a sleek black folder from her briefcase and sliding it down the table. We signed this, on the cover. The Herbal Accord Compliance Manual, confidential draft, co-authored by Blackstone Dominion Holdings. A few executives flinched. One leaned back in his chair like the document might explode. We're not negotiating with activists, said Richard Lowe, VP of Legal Affairs. They don't have leverage. They do now. Jacqueline replied unfazed. You're sitting in this room because Darius King rerouted a flight. That wasn't a tantrum. That was a power play. He didn't escalate. He dismantled, quietly, strategically, and without raising his voice, he made the entire world lean in. The committee fell silent again. She let the silence breathe before continuing. The public doesn't trust us anymore, but they trust him. And unless we want to be known as the airline that burned at 35,000 feet because of arrogance, we adapt. Today, there was a knock at the door. An assistant peeked in, whispering something to Jacqueline. Her expression shifted slightly, and she motioned for the assistant to hand her the slip of paper. She scanned it once, then twice, and finally her eyes locked with the room. Darius King has just filed a formal motion through the FAA requesting permission to fund and independently manage a third-party passenger respect audit program across all Class A international airports. The table erupted. That's unconstitutional. That's a conflict of interest he can't possibly be. Jacqueline raised her hand. He already is, she said. And unless we get ahead of it, we're not just going to lose passengers. We're going to lose equity endorsements in every future contract that depends on ethical sourcing. She looked directly at the head of partnerships. How many corporate alliances have paused discussions since last Thursday? He fumbled with a tablet. 14, he admitted. 9 pending termination. 5 on indefinite hold. 14 multi-million-dollar partnerships, Jacqueline repeated. Gone. Over a cup of tea and a stain on a suit. And then, almost as if on cue, a tone pinged from her phone. She glanced down and froze. Another one, she murmured. The World Hospitality Council just issued a resolution in support of the Herbal Accord. They've called Darius King's actions a model of nonviolent executive reform. For a moment, no one moved. The silence, once useful for hiding, now felt like suffocation. Across the city, Darius sat in a quiet midtown lounge watching the news unfold from a private booth. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. Power wasn't in the headline. It was in the pacing of the ripple, how long it echoed. His assistant approached, placing a tablet in front of him. "They're panicking," she said. "They should," Darius replied without looking up. Back in the conference room, Richard finally spoke again. "If we sign this accord, we lose control of our brand. We become part of his narrative." "No," Jacqueline said, her voice now soft but laced with steel. "If we don't sign, we lose our brand. And the public writes the narrative without us." Then quietly she added, "The future doesn't belong to those who shout loudest anymore. It belongs to those who are seen, especially when no one's looking." And in that moment, even Richard understood. The rules had changed. Darius King hadn't just rerouted a flight, he had rerouted the system. The boardroom doors closed with a soft thud, sealing off the silent committee's deliberations from the rest of the world. But the effects of Darius King's maneuver were already leaking through the walls, emails forwarded, whispers echoing through corridors, staff gathering in hushed groups near vending machines and break rooms. The building itself had become tense like a pressure chamber, one breath away from fracture. Down 3 floors in the Department of Human Capital and Ethics, the meeting room lights flickered on. At the head of the table stood Camille Hartwell, Senior Director of Organizational Culture, a position that until now had been largely symbolic. Camille had spent years advocating reform in quiet memos and afterthought presentations, documents routinely sidelined in favor of brand cohesion and market positioning. But today they had called her in. Today she had teeth. "Pull every internal bias incident from the last 5 years," she said, without preamble. "Cross-reference with HR complaints, flight manifest data, and customer escalation logs. I want a pattern: visual, numerical, emotional. Anything that can't be denied." Her team looked at one another, stunned. Camille was always measured, never reactive. But now her voice had an edge to it. Not loud, but sharpened, as if it had finally been unsheathed. A younger analyst, Miguel, raised a hand. "You're expecting a pattern." "I'm expecting a fire map," Camille answered. "Let's see where it always burns and who keeps striking the match." Elsewhere in the same building, a parallel investigation was underway, one cloaked in legal review and sanitized language. The Risk Mitigation Division, tasked with identifying internal exposure, was drafting what they termed a post-event tolerance assessment. In plain English, who was to blame and how to make them vanish without triggering lawsuits. But this time HR didn't hold the shield. Camille had insisted on bypassing the old structure. She knew what they'd do: bury it. So instead, she tapped into her back channels. Her team worked in silence, pulling data sets that hadn't been touched in years. Audio records from complaint calls, interview logs from fired employees, transcripts of training programs that had quietly omitted any reference to racial bias. By noon, the digital dashboard was glowing red. There it was mapped out in pixels, in percentages, decisions, denials, dismissals. All of them slowly converging around one core truth: it wasn't just about the flight attendant. It wasn't just about Carl. The system had failed systemically, and it had done so with plausible deniability etched into every line of its code. Camille leaned forward, scrolling through heat maps that showed where customers of color were disproportionately seated, flagged, or rerouted. It wasn't the tea, she whispered. It was the routine. She tapped her stylus against the screen. This is what Darius saw. This is what he unraveled before we even knew it was happening. Meanwhile, in a quieter wing of the corporate campus, Darius's formal documentation was beginning to arrive. Each letter from his legal team was precise, written in unemotional language, but weaponized with intent. The tone wasn't threatening, it was declarative. It wasn't if there was wrongdoing, it was how long it had been tolerated. And buried in the documentation was something even more powerful: first-hand testimonies. Not from Darius, but from passengers, former employees, and whistleblowers whose voices had never made it past a complaint hotline. Until now. One story stood out: an elderly black woman flying to her granddaughter's wedding who was denied warm water for her medication. Another spoke of a Middle Eastern passenger who was interrogated midair over a misunderstood phrase. Each testimony was short, vivid, and damning. Not because they were new, but because they were suddenly being believed. And all of it pointed back to the same structural rot. On Camille's desk, her phone buzzed. She picked it up without glancing at the screen. "Camille Hartwell," she answered. The voice on the other end was gravel and smoke. "Ms. Hartwell, this is Executive Liaison Kent Alvarez. You're needed upstairs." Her grip tightened around the phone. "What for?" "For something called the Legacy Review," Kent said. "Apparently, Mr. King made a direct recommendation that you lead it." There was a pause. Camille blinked. She had never spoken to Darius King directly. Only seen him once at an industry summit years ago, where he'd stood in the back, listening more than talking. She remembered thinking, that man watches differently, like he's measuring the room for weight, not just faces. And now he had summoned her. By name. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said. She hung up, looked around the room at her team people who had followed her through years of institutional dismissal, token acknowledgments, and departmental isolation. And now finally the system had cracked. Print everything she told them. "We're not asking for permission anymore. We're rewriting the terms." 5 minutes later, she stepped into the executive elevator alone. Her reflection stared back in the chrome wall, shoulders, square lips, set eyes burning with quiet fury. This wasn't a promotion. This was a reckoning, and she was ready to deliver it. By the time Camille Hartwell stepped into the Legacy Review chamber, the air had shifted. Gone was the comfortable arrogance that usually settled in corporate boardrooms. In its place was a raw, sharpened stillness, like the final seconds before a blade fell. The room itself was sterile, almost clinical. Frosted glass walls, charcoal gray paneling, a long obsidian table surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs. Only 5 of them were occupied. At the head sat Darius King. He wasn't speaking. He didn't need to. His presence alone bent the posture of every executive in the room. His fingers were tented under his chin, his tailored midnight blue suit untouched by a single wrinkle. Across the polished table, nervous glances bounced between the remaining board members like sparks between dry leaves. Camille walked in, not timidly, not defiantly, but with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and was done tolerating it. "Ms. Hartwell," Darius said, standing as she entered, "this seat is yours now." He motioned to the chair to his right, the traditional position of the compliance advisor. Only this time she wasn't here to advise. She was here to investigate. The moment she sat, the lights dimmed and a screen came to life behind her. A map flickered on a heat map of internal incidents by location, department, and demographic profile. Color-coded in red, orange, and yellow, it told a story no amount of corporate language could spin. It was the airline's unspoken history of discrimination, now projected 10 feet tall. Gasps filled the room. One executive, Derek Langston, VP of Global Relations, actually leaned back as if recoiling from fire. "This is what we've ignored," Camille began, her voice calm but anchored in steel. We've built a culture where certain faces are treated as threats before they're even acknowledged as customers, where protocol is used to mask prejudice, and where silence has protected those who least deserve it. Camille Derrick interrupted, his voice clipped. Surely there is a more nuanced. There is no nuance in humiliation. Camille cut in. There is only policy or prejudice. Pick one. No one spoke. Camille turned back to the screen and pressed a button on her tablet. A clip began to play. It was surveillance footage from inside the terminal, a grainy, silent recording of Carl, the flight attendant, pouring coffee onto Darius King's sleeve. It paused at the exact moment the liquid splashed against the expensive fabric. The room stared in stunned silence. Still think it was an accident? Camille asked. Another clip began audio from the passenger complaint line. A woman's voice trembling and elderly. He said my boarding pass looked fake. I've been flying with you for 20 years. Then another, I told them I had a medical condition. They said I should have paid for first class if I wanted sympathy. And another, I asked for tea. They said, what are you, royalty now? Everyone laughed. I didn't. Each one built on the last, like layers of sediment, forming a fossilized record of institutional rot. Camille turned to the executives. These stories were never anonymous. You chose not to hear them. Darius finally spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried like thunder. When I took this seat, I wasn't just reacting to a coffee stain or a disrespectful smirk. I was responding to a pattern, the kind you all pretended didn't exist, the kind you blamed on training gaps and individual failures. But let's be clear, this wasn't a Carl problem. It was a culture problem. And culture starts here. His hand swept across the table. No more scripts, he said. No more drafted apologies. No more buried emails labeled sensitive but not actionable. Camille leaned forward, placing a thick binder on the table with a firm thud. This is our recommendation. Full restructure of frontline protocols. Termination of 3 regional directors. Immediate implementation of our equity integration standard. And a mandatory legacy audit for every department head. You have 72 hours to comply or step aside. Reeves, the newly installed CEO, wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. You're proposing we tear the system apart. No, Darius corrected him. We're proposing we rebuild it. You're just uncomfortable that you won't control the blueprint. A beat of silence. Then Camille slid a final document across the table. And one more thing. We're renaming the first class tier. Reeves blinked. To what equity class? Camille replied. The room exploded with objections. Equity class, that's political. That'll anger our premium clients. That's going to damage the brand. Darius raised a hand. You've already damaged it, he said. We're just giving it a new spine. The words settled like smoke across the glass room. Camille stood up and faced the room one last time. This isn't just a name change, it's a statement. The new first class is for people who've earned their place, not just because of money, but because we finally see their full humanity. She turned to Darius. He gave the smallest nod. Outside the room, staff began to gather. Word was spreading. The old order was collapsing, and this time it wasn't being replaced with a memo. It was being rebuilt in plain view. The memo went live at 10:01 a.m. Not just sent, not quietly delivered into inboxes or slipped across desks. No, it was posted, printed, and pinned. It appeared across internal dashboards behind break room glass in the lounges, terminals, and gate areas of 137 airport hubs. It even interrupted the in-flight entertainment on 6 aircrafts mid-air, the screen dimming momentarily before broadcasting a clean black slide with white text, equity class is not a perk. It's a principle. Underneath, effective immediately, all premium class service protocols will follow the equity integration standard. Respect is no longer optional. And just like that, it began. Across terminals and concourses, the announcement landed like a second heartbeat. It wasn't just a change in nomenclature. It was a cultural reset. The frontline staff at Luxair, pilots, porters, agents, stewards, looked at one another in stunned silence. In some airports, they clapped. In others, they whispered. But everywhere, they began to move differently. Darius had not asked them to fall in line. He had asked them to rise. Within hours, the backlash began. A handful of elite travelers took to social media bemoaning the dilution of luxury. They called it virtue signaling. One posted, if I pay $4,000 for a seat, I want more than a slogan. The post got ratioed in under 30 minutes. Because by noon, the other voices had arrived. A former Luxair baggage handler posted a story about how she was demoted for wearing her natural hair. A woman shared how her mother, a retired educator, was made to wait in a separate queue after being profiled at the check-in gate. The stories didn't stop. They came like rainfall, heavy cleansing, undeniable. And in the middle of it all stood Darius King. He wasn't giving interviews, he didn't need to. His message had already gone viral, not through press releases but through policy, not with hashtags but with consequences. At the Central Employee Lounge of Halvin International, a young ground crew worker named Miguel stood in front of the break room screen staring at the memo. "They really did it," he murmured half to himself. He actually did it. Beside him, an older woman in a navy blazer nodded slowly. Her name was Ruth. She had worked at Luxair for 22 years and had never seen a CEO enter her department until the previous week. She turned to Miguel. "You remember what he said when he visited?" Miguel nodded. "You won't have to raise your voice anymore." Ruth smiled faintly. That stayed with me. Upstairs in the lounge designated for equity class clients, the energy was different. First-time flyers, people who once felt watched, measured, or overlooked, now moved through the space with an ease that hadn't been there before. There were no stares when a woman wearing a hijab walked in. No smirks when a man in worn jeans pulled out a platinum ticket. The hostess instructed to ask one simple question at entry. "How can I help you feel seen today?" Greeted each guest with it and waited for a real answer. And for the first time in the airline's history, people gave one. "I just want to not be treated like I don't belong. I want hot tea without an eye roll. I want you to look me in the eye and say my name right." They weren't asking for more than what was already on the menu. They were asking to matter. At 2:00 p.m., a private staff session began in the amphitheater-style conference hall of Luxair HQ. The session was for mid-level managers and it was mandatory. The speaker, Camille Hartwell. No slides, no corporate jargon, just Camille in a gray blazer holding a single index card. "This card," she said, raising it, "has a name written on it. It's not a famous name, not a wealthy one, not someone who holds stock in our company. It's the name of a man who filed 17 complaints with us over the past 5 years. He was told, 'We're looking into it,' 17 times. Nothing changed," she paused, "until last week, when he sent complaint number 18. That one landed on my desk, because he happened to be in line behind Mr. Darius King." The room fell silent. You see, you don't know which customer is going to be the one who dismantles your silence, the one who brings the system down. So here's the new rule. You treat everyone like they're that one, every time. No exceptions. A hand went up in the back. A man in a brown tie stood. "What if we get it wrong? What if we're trying but we still offend someone?" Camille smiled. "You will get it wrong, and that's okay. The issue isn't the mistake. It's the refusal to listen afterward. Dignity starts when you stop defending yourself and start asking why someone was hurt." A murmur of understanding passed through the room. In a control tower, 400 miles away, an air traffic controller who had followed the entire incident from the headlines turned to his colleague and said, "You know, it's weird. I feel proud. Not of the airline, of us, of someone finally pushing back." His colleague, a woman with deep lines on her forehead and headphones around her neck, nodded. "He made them see what we always knew, and now they can't unsee it." Outside, dust settled over the airfield. Runways glowed like arteries of light. Aircraft began their final descents. And in lounges, terminals, and cockpits, a subtle shift had taken hold, not just in policy but in posture. For the first time, people weren't whispering about what happened. They were echoing it. The system hadn't fallen, it had been flipped. By sunrise the next morning, a message had been quietly delivered to every executive at Luxair, not by email, not through a calendar invite, but via hard copy printed on black linen cardstock embossed in silver ink. "You are cordially required." It wasn't a request, it was an expectation. At 7:45 a.m., they were to assemble on the 54th floor of the Dominion Tower, the private headquarters of Darius King. No one was late. The glass elevator that took them there moved in complete silence, floor numbers illuminating in a slow vertical crawl. Outside, the skyline bathed in morning amber, the city awakening below them. Inside, the air was tighter than the space deserved, crisp suits, crisp nerves. Daniel Reeves, the newly installed CEO, stood stiffly in the corner. His eyes never left the changing floors. He didn't speak to the others. He barely breathed. He knew exactly where he was going, and he wasn't in charge. At 7:44, the elevator doors opened with a dignified hiss, revealing a hallway of polished obsidian stone and indirect gold lighting. It was soundproofed, every step swallowed, every thought amplified. At the end stood a door etched with a single word: legacy. Inside, the boardroom stretched long and narrow like a runway. At its head sat Darius King, not at the table but behind it on a platform raised by a single step. It wasn't a throne, it was a vantage point. He stood when they entered. No handshake, no welcome speech, just presence. Reeves spoke first. "Mr. King, thank you for having us. We," Darius raised a hand, not aggressively but decisively. "You're not here to speak," he said. "You're here to listen." He motioned to the seat closest to him. Not at the center, the edge. Reeves sat. Darius looked at them not just as a group, but one by one. "You built an empire with marble and polish, but you never checked the foundation. You forgot that respect isn't built with money. It's built with memory. And the people you dismissed remember." A woman near the center, Luxair's former VP of Premium Services, opened her mouth. "Why now?" she asked. "Why take over an airline over tea?" Darius's eyes locked onto hers. "It wasn't tea," he said flatly. "It was a pattern, a beat of silence." He pressed a button on the wall behind him. The lights dimmed slightly. Screens embedded in the table flickered to life. One by one, they displayed flight logs, employee testimonies, audio recordings of passenger complaints, all ignored, all buried, all time-stamped. Then came the footage, a looped 14-second clip of the flight attendant spilling hot coffee on him. On repeat, on the sixth loop, Darius spoke again. "You see what I see?" No one responded. "I see indifference." He clicked a remote. The image changed to social media posts from the day of the detour, passenger reactions, news headlines, market dips. One screen showed a chart stock valuation collapsing in real time. And now he continued, his voice never rising. "You don't just have a PR crisis, you have a cultural one." He stepped down from the platform and began to walk slowly, methodically along the length of the table. "I didn't reroute that plane because of hot coffee. I rerouted it because you don't listen to complaints unless they cost you money." He stopped behind Reeves. "You see this man?" he asked the room. "He was put here to contain the damage, not to correct the system." Reeves stiffened, but he didn't speak. Darius continued, "I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in reinvention." From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a new document stitched in leather labeled Operation Elevation. "This is your only job now," he said. "You will take this company and remake it, not in your image, but in the image of the people you've never invited into these rooms." The pages outlined a three-phase transformation of equity-based service training, frontline-led leadership rotations, and public transparency protocols. It was more than DEI. It was reconstruction. "And if we fail," one executive asked quietly. Darius turned to him. "You won't," he said, "because failure isn't an option. It's a replacement." He returned to the front of the room. "You have 30 days. He tapped the table once. The screens went dark. The room stayed silent. Then for the first time that morning, Darius smiled, not wide, not warm, but true. "Let's see what happens when respect isn't optional anymore." He walked out. The door closed behind him with a whisper, not a slam, not a grand finale, just finality. Outside, the skyline of the city glittered under a rising sun. The world below had no idea what was coming, but it would, because Darius wasn't finished. He was only elevating. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the first tremor hit the media cycle. A link appeared in the inboxes of every major journalist at the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNN, Reuters, and a dozen aviation watchdog groups. It came from an encrypted Proton Mail account, untraceable, unrevealed, unbothered. Subject line: Lux Air Internal Culture Report, for immediate publication attached, was a 91-page PDF. The file name, the folder, they ignored. Inside was everything. Whistleblower statements from flight attendants. Racist jokes sent between regional managers over internal Slack. Cabin crew evaluations where too urban was listed as a reason for non-promotion. Screenshot after screenshot of ignored HR complaints. And then toward the end, a memo marked confidential. "Let's avoid placing diverse faces in first class unless they match the expected income demographic." Less friction that way. It was signed by a former VP of client aesthetics. By noon, it had gone viral. Darius didn't tweet it. He didn't need to. The press picked it up like it was gasoline in a lit match. Headlines exploded across every feed: luxury airline under fire for discriminatory practices. Leaked files reveal racism at 30,000 feet. CEO's in-flight retaliation shakes aviation industry. Inside Dominion Tower. Darius King watched it unfold in silence. He wasn't in his office. Not today. He stood in a war room, a glass-walled suite on the 57th floor. Its only furniture, a black conference table, 12 velvet chairs, and 4 massive wall screens displaying media feeds, financial markets, and real-time social sentiment analysis. The airline's stock was in free fall. The ticker bled red. Customer service queues were overloaded. Booking cancellations surged by 43% in under 2 hours. Credit card partners issued emergency notices. Travel influencers began boycotting publicly. The dominoes had only just begun to fall. Darius's lead strategist, Nina Barrett, stood beside him, arms crossed, sharp eyes flicking across a risk dashboard. She wore no expression, just calculation. "We expected this to move fast," she said, "but not this fast." Darius didn't blink. "That's because we underestimated how many people they've humiliated in silence. This was never about me. It was about how many voices they buried." Nina nodded. "The anonymous submission line is already flooded. Stories going back 10 years. Darius turned away from the screens. "Good, let them all speak." Meanwhile, across the city, the new CEO of Luxair, Daniel Reeves, sat in a windowless room, his tie undone, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. His legal team flanked him, visibly rattled. On the table before them sat a single printed page: Operation Elevation, the transformation initiative Darius had handed them just days earlier. But now, under the crushing weight of the leaks, the initiative was no longer internal. It was public, and failing to implement it now would be seen not just as corporate negligence, but complicity. "We're being slaughtered," one lawyer said. "We need a full admission of guilt, or they'll start naming executives next." Daniel Reeves rubbed his temples. "If we admit to everything, we lose every investor we've got." "If you don't," the lawyer replied, "you won't have a company to save." That afternoon, the airline held a press conference. Darius did not attend, but his presence was everywhere. The new leadership announced sweeping reforms, an independent investigation, the dismantling of the premium service division, and the resignation of 6 top executives. Yet it wasn't enough. A single tweet from Darius's official account, his first public comment, went live at 3:44 p.m. "Reform isn't a speech, it's accountability. You don't get to erase a decade of disrespect with one press conference. See you in the report." It trended globally within 6 minutes. By evening, news outlets were reporting on the financial contagion. Luxair's credit rating had been downgraded. Their alliance partners began distancing themselves, and 2 pending international mergers were abruptly paused. Behind the scenes, Darius had already begun building an alternative. He wasn't just exposing an airline, he was preparing to replace it. In a private hangar near the edge of the city, a sleek aircraft waited, matte black fuselage, no branding, just a single emblem on the tail, a minimalist crown formed by 5 outstretched wings. The name Kingdom One. His own line, his own rules. First class not by appearance but by dignity. The interiors were already under construction: whisper-quiet cabins, inclusive service protocols, crew trained in equity-based hospitality. Every passenger, every employee would be respected no matter what they wore, how they looked, or who they were. As the sun set across the hangar tarmac, Darius stood near the nose of the aircraft, arms folded. Nina approached quietly. "We're ahead of schedule," she said. Darius didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the plane. "They took everything I stood for and boiled it down to a drink order," he said. "Now I'll give them a new standard. Let them try to catch up." The fluorescent lights inside the hangar flickered once, and with it the world shifted again. By the next morning, it wasn't just about Darius King anymore. It was about the system. The mainstream media had caught up. No longer spinning the incident as a VIP complaint gone viral, news anchors and columnists began connecting the dots: systemic discrimination disguised as standard operating procedure. Talk shows ran side by side, comparisons: Darius in his joggers rejected, a hedge fund exec in board shorts and sandals escorted without question. Public fury wasn't flickering, it was blazing. Respect. In-flight trended globally. Kingdom One began appearing in headlines without a single press release. Inside Dominion Tower, Darius's executive war room had evolved. Overnight, a new team had joined the operation: cultural anthropologists, brand psychologists, and equity architects. This wasn't just damage control anymore. This was architectural dismantling. What we're witnessing, said Dr. Evelyn Hale, a Harvard sociologist who had advised Fortune 50 companies on culture change, isn't a viral moment. It's a cultural audit live. Darius stood at the end of the table, listening more than speaking, his presence the gravitational center of the room. In front of him lay a blueprint for something bigger than revenge, a long-term infrastructure shift powered by values. Phase 1 had already begun. Kingdom One wasn't just a vanity project, it was an answer, a high-altitude experiment in rehumanizing luxury travel. But Darius knew optics weren't enough. What made Kingdom One dangerous wasn't the jets, it was the manifesto. On the second page of its internal charter was a sentence that echoed louder than a slogan: "Power isn't how loud you are. It's how silent the system becomes when you speak." That was what had happened at 38,000 feet. They tried to silence him, and in doing so they made him louder than they could contain. Back at Luxair, chaos reigned. Executives scrambled to contain the spread of internal leaks. Sponsors threatened to suspend advertising deals. Private WhatsApp groups among flight crew were exposed, revealing offhanded comments and emojis mocking entitled passengers. One group chat even joked about Darius's tea tantrum. It went viral. Darius didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already secured meetings with 5 of the top venture capital firms investing in aviation tech. They weren't just eager, they were lining up. One firm had offered $200 in Series A funding before seeing a single prototype. Why? Because they knew the public was ready to switch allegiance. Because power was migrating. Because Kingdom One wasn't just a fleet, it was an idea. Meanwhile, back in the public eye, Luxair attempted to regain control of the narrative. They hosted a reconciliation summit at their headquarters, complete with inclusive panels, hashtags, and hand-picked testimonials. They even invited Darius to attend. He declined. Instead, he released a 3-minute video. Black backdrop, no music, just his face, his voice. "I didn't ask for this fight," he said, "but the moment you poured that coffee and dismissed my name, you started it. This isn't about drinks. This is about dignity. You don't get to fix decades of discrimination with a panel and a press kit. You change by handing over the system." It garnered 14 million views in under 24 hours. The next blow came from within. A whistleblower named Stephanie Morales, a former Luxair HR director, stepped forward publicly. She shared how for years employee complaints about racial profiling were quietly buried. One line from her televised interview became a lightning rod. "We had protocols for champagne, but none for fairness." That was the death knell. Darius's legal team filed a class action support campaign, not a lawsuit, not yet, but a coalition of employees and passengers alike, gathering testimonials, receipts, timelines. They called it the ledger. For every complaint Luxair had buried, the ledger would document it. By the end of the day, over 3,000 submissions had flooded in. And just like that, what started as a hot cup of coffee turned into a boiling indictment of an entire industry. Darius knew the timing had to be perfect. That evening, his head of PR, Morgan Tate, entered the executive suite with a calm nod. "It's time." Darius turned toward the monitors. One showed Luxair stock still in freefall. Another showed Kingdom One's new microsite. At the top of the homepage was a question: what if respect wasn't a luxury? Under it, a single flight icon pulsed quietly. The inaugural route had been announced: New York to Lagos. It wasn't just a route, it was a statement. From Wall Street to West Africa, from boardroom to homeland, the flight would redefine what it meant to be first class. Not by race, not by resume, but by how you treat people at every altitude. The board members at Dominion Ventures sat silently as Darius spoke that night. He wasn't making a pitch. He was making history. "We were never supposed to be here," he said, his voice low, steady. "But if you keep shutting doors, eventually someone will build a jet." In the room, white-haired financiers, legacy operators, a few skeptics turned believers erupted in a standing ovation. Outside, the lights of the city shimmered like constellations. The world was watching. But more importantly, it was listening. The following morning, as dawn broke over the skyline, The city below buzzed with headlines, hashtags, and headlines about Darius King. But inside his penthouse office, 40 floors above the chaos, there was silence. A deep, reverent silence. He stood by the window, a glass of water in one hand, overlooking the river that carved its way through the city. The sun rose slowly, its golden light refracting across the skyline like the calm after a storm. It was the same city that had once judged him by his hoodie, his skin, his silence. Now it bent to his presence. But power had never been the point. Not for Darius. Control was a tool. Influence was leverage. But dignity was the legacy. And dignity was what he had demanded, not with shouts or lawsuits, but with pressure, precision, and presence. Across the room, his assistant quietly entered with a thick folder. "The final metrics, sir," she said. Darius took it, flipped through the pages without a word. He saw it all: stock drops, media fallout, new board members appointed, termination letters signed by trembling hands, and perhaps most significantly, Luxair's new official policy. The King Clause. It wasn't called that publicly, but everyone in the industry already knew. A clause now mandated that no first-class client be judged or denied service based on subjective appearance, attire, accent, or presumed status. It would become industry standard within months. Other airlines were already scrambling to adopt similar protections. All of it, the detour, the memo, the media storm, had led to this. Systemic realignment. Still, Darius wasn't finished. Later that day, he stood at the front of a private auditorium filled with executives, journalists, culture critics, and young entrepreneurs. The event wasn't open to the public. It was invitation only, an elite summit for those who shaped industries but too often ignored their impact. He didn't enter to applause. He entered to stillness. No slides, no branding, just a stool, glass of water, and his story. "Some of you," he began, voice calm and low, "still think I changed the flight path to be petty." He looked up. "You're wrong." A pause. "I changed it because we needed a new direction, not just in the air, but in how we treat people at altitude. For decades, we've measured worth by the way someone looks when they step on board. We've dressed that up in words like security protocol or client curation. But let's be honest, it's bias, refined bias." He let the words sink in. Respect isn't a menu item. You don't serve it to people who look like they can afford it. You build it into the system like oxygen in a pressurized cabin. Invisible, essential, expected. Heads nodded. He told them everything. From the coffee spill to the corporate apology, from the pilot's hesitation to the new CEO's desperate phone call. He spoke of the silent humiliation, the cold glances, the subtle language of exclusion. And then he shifted. "But this isn't about me," he said. "It never was." He gestured to the screen behind him. It lit up with the faces of employees who had spoken out, former Luxair staffers, clients who had been ignored, flight attendants who had witnessed discrimination but had no power to intervene. Their testimonials had formed the backbone of the ledger, his masterstroke of corporate exposure. These are the voices that change companies. He said, his tone sharper now. Not press agents, not shareholders, not board members who hide behind protocol. These people are the pulse of your industry. Ignore them and you will collapse. Silence. Then softly, one journalist asked, "So what do we do now?" Darius didn't hesitate. "You rewire the system," he said. "You stop pretending equity is a press campaign and start treating it like air traffic control. Without it, people crash." He ended the talk with no applause cue, no call for celebration. He simply walked off stage. Let the weight of the truth do the talking. Back at his office, a new message lit up his phone. It was from Daniel Reeves, the former Luxair CEO, now quietly running an equity training nonprofit. He had taken Darius's warning to heart and disappeared from public view after stepping down. But his message was short, sincere. "You were right. Thank you for showing me the ponds." Darius didn't reply. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered. Later that night, standing once again by his window, Darius watched a plane arc across the sky. Its lights blinked softly in the clouds. He didn't know the airline or the passengers or where it was headed, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe maybe that plane now carried someone who would be seen, heard, respected. Because somewhere along that journey, the system had changed its course. He didn't burn the world. He redirected it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching and see you next time.